Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waste 360's Nothing Wasted podcast. On every episode, we invite the most interesting people in waste, recycling, and organics to sit down with us and chat candidly about their thoughts, their work, this unique industry, and so much more. So thanks for listening and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Liz Bothwell from Waste 360 with Hamzah Mazari, Managing Director of Jefferies. Hamzah is also one of our previous 40 Under 40 award winners. Welcome, and thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So we usually start in the beginning. So can you please tell me a bit about your background and how you ended up in finance and focused on our industry?
Sure. I graduated Stanford University with a degree in economics and got into public accounting and did my CPA, and then got into banking on the M&A side, and then really wanted to specialize in an industry and thought equity research was the best way to do that, and always loved the stock market, and decided to join Credit Suisse over a decade ago. And just by chance, we used to bank waste management, and they needed an analyst to cover that space. And, waste wasn't my first choice of industry. You don't really think of waste initially when you think of covering an industry, but sort of raised my hand, got into it. And it was a very exciting time back then because waste management was doing a hostile takeover of Republic. Republic was buying Allied Waste. So there was a lot of action in the space, and, got great exposure, and have ever since then have developed very strong relationships in the space and have been covering the sector for a long time, but sort of just got into it by chance, if you will.
Well, we're glad you're here and appreciate all you do in covering the market and being such a great advocate for the industry itself.
Thank you.
I'm sure you've had a busy few weeks and the market has been more volatile than it has been in ages. Can you share anything about the coronavirus and its impact on the market in general, and then specifically how it's affecting public waste industry stocks?
Sure. So, whenever there's uncertainty in the marketplace, the stock market assumes the worst. And so, we're about 20% plus off of the peak that we saw in the market, and there's probably more downside until the market gets clarity that the virus is contained. And so what we're seeing in the marketplace is that it's had a very big impact on travel and leisure. So you look at the airlines are down 60%, cruise lines are down 70%, car rentals down 60%. And so there's a direct impact to travel and leisure as people are being quarantined and not traveling, not eating out, etc. We do think that it's a little too early to say if we're going to go in recession because of this. I think you have to assume that the U.S. consumer freezes up totally and U.S. consumer spend drops a lot for us to go into a recession. But until this virus is contained, we continue to think the market's going to be very volatile. Over the long term, we do think this could be a buying opportunity if you're very long term, because we do think that the virus eventually will get contained. It may take a few months. You look at what happened in China. It is already, cases are going down there. And so I think if you look at the waste names and the impact of COVID-19 or coronavirus on the space, we think about 80% of the business, frankly, is unlikely to get impacted, maybe 85%. And the reason is that, a lot of that business is residential subscription or small commercial container or large container reoccurring. Waste is the last thing that gets cut when things go bad. So container weights may be a little bit lighter, but we don't think you're going to see service decreases right away. And so that business is pretty contained. Where we look to potentially see an impact is more on the special waste side or C&D volumes, which tend to be more on-demand based or project-based. So you could see some of that get pushed out. But again, very minimal impact to the waste space relative to other companies out there in the marketplace. Pricing is uncorrelated, we think, to coronavirus, so pricing will continue to be strong in the space. And we're not forecasting a U.S. consumer recession. That would impact the space, but again, we don't think that happens. So, any pullback in the waste companies is probably a buying opportunity, we think, longer term.
Okay, so that's some positive that can come out of this for sure.
Right.
Now, do you think the current environment will anyway impact the pace of deals or the M&A pipeline?
We don't think so. And the reason for that largely is that the private companies, which we think make up about $17 billion in revenue today, a lot of those companies have been wanting to sell ahead of the November 2020 election due to potential changes in tax law. And so if you look at the last 3 years under President Trump, there's been an M&A super cycle. Waste Connections, for example, has done more deals in the last 3 years than they've done in 8 years previous. And so we think there's another year of very heavy deal flow to happen. You have companies like GFL that are on an acquisition spree, and even companies like Republic, which tend to be conservative around M&A, have talked about M&A coming in higher than what they've done traditionally. So we think it's very much driven by, potential election dynamics. And then I think when you get into next year, 2021, maybe you see M&A slow a little bit. But at the same time, right, valuations in the waste space are still relatively good, even with the market pullback. And so it's a good time for a seller to still try to get that multiple before it starts moving down further.
And what about recycled commodities?
Yeah, so we look at OCC, and as you know, we've been in a OCC and recycling recession, right? OCC, old corrugated container, is basically the 70% of the recycling business or more. And pricing for OCC since the China Green Fence took place in November 2017, right, went from $200 a ton to $20, below 2009 levels. When you look at February pricing, we've ticked up versus January. So we do think that, pricing in OCC has bottomed. Recycling maybe makes up 7-8% of sector revenues. However, it comes off at a very high decremental margin. And so when we look at recycling, we're coming off of almost a, 3-year recession in pricing. Pricing has now ticked up. We do think there's some new paper capacity coming online in the U.S., specifically containerboard capacity that's probably a buyer of OCC. And so some of the demand drivers domestically are getting better. Pricing's ticked up. We do think that recycling now becomes either a tailwind or, at worst case, a net neutral to the business as you look over the next year, 2 years. And a lot of these companies have actually taken a very proactive stance and tried to reduce contamination at the MRFs, at the same time tried to restructure some of their recycling contracts. So that business will become a better business over time, but it has been a bad business over the last, 3 years.
Thank you. And then do you think waste companies have contingency plans to protect personnel right now?
I think they do. As a small example, Waste Management has canceled some investor conferences because they've limited overnight travel for employees in order to protect them. And so, that's a small example, but I think that trickles down to the field level and the operational staff. And so I do think that, they are taking a very proactive approach around protecting the employee base. And I think that in general, the companies have done a good job in trying to lower employee turnover. A lot of these companies also invested tax reform savings in improving employee facilities, locker rooms. And so I do think that the sector does care about the employees a lot, and you're beginning to obviously see that in terms of how they protect the employees through this very tough time.
True. And then do you think there's an opportunity for medical waste here?
It's a great question. We we think when you look at the med waste business, you really need to see a vaccine developed for coronavirus for there to be more medical waste volume. You need to see a lot more people go to hospitals to get tested. But as long as we're in the current environment where people are essentially buying more Lysol wipes and Persol hand sanitizer, that as a prevention mechanism is not going to generate more med waste. So it likely doesn't help until we develop a vaccine for coronavirus, and then it could potentially be a tailwind. It's not a negative for med waste, but we don't think it's going to be a big tailwind until there's a vaccine developed. Also, keep in mind, some of these med waste contracts are fixed pricing or fixed fee, particularly around sharps or needles and syringes. So, there is a little bit of contract structure to keep in mind in terms of, when you think about profitability of the med waste business. So, if there's a vaccine developed and it results in more med waste, it'll be a benefit. But right now, we're not seeing that.
Okay. So something to watch for sure. And so it seems that air quality in China has improved since the outbreak of corona. Are there environmental benefits of people not traveling as much and to watch China's decline in factory activity?
I think that's right. I mean, I think if you look at China, frankly, one of the reasons they put the green fence in place, which, destroyed OCC pricing, was frankly that they wanted to shut down smaller paper mills that pollute a lot. We do think some of that was environmentally driven and also to reduce contamination clearly of the material that they were bringing in. And so we do think China's air quality has improved. There's a lot more focus on environmental there. We do think that as factory pollution goes down and as people travel less, there is a benefit to the carbon footprint. And so that is a benefit to the environment. We expect that to, continue.
And then what other indicators will you be watching in the short term and the long term?
I think the key indicator that we'll be watching in the short term is the March data around personal consumption. And so when you look at March, if the U.S. consumer hasn't frozen up as much as people think, then we think that the coronavirus impact on the U.S. consumer is maybe overblown by the market. So that's the key indicator that we're going to watch. We do think some of the PMI and ISM data around U.S. industrial production, we'll watch that data, but we do already know supply chains have been impacted due to the virus, especially in auto production and some other industries. Oil and gas we know is already weak, and that translates into the U.S. IP number. So there are expectations that data will be weak anyway. But I think the real data to watch that we're looking at is, what happens to the U.S. consumer and monitoring U.S. personal consumption.
Thank you. That makes sense. And then, so Hamzah, what do waste stocks tell investors about the broader U.S. economy and the stock market?
We think that the U.S. waste companies generally are defensive companies. We think that they're not as cyclical as we saw in 2009. We do think that the companies are a very good barometer on a pulse on the U.S. consumer. We think that the commercial, residential, and large container industrial business, which make up maybe 85% plus of the sector revenues, are very tied to U.S. personal consumption. So it's a very good barometer on what the U.S. economy is doing, because 70% of GDP is tied to services as well as the consumer. It's not as great an indicator on the U.S. industrial cycle because manufacturing is only about 10% of revenue. Having said that, we look at special waste volumes, we look at construction volumes, which tend to be more of a leading indicator as to what the economy is going to do. And so generally, it's a very good barometer overall on the economy. We do, however, will caveat that and say that this sector is late cycle, meaning that it does lag by 1 year going into a recession. So it does tend to be, defensive in that nature. But yeah, very good indicator, bottom line, on what the U.S. consumer is doing.
And then I know you've spoken about technology in the past, and you see potential for technology in the industry. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it has changed your view of the industry and where you think it could take the industry?
Sure. So when we look at technology as impact on the waste sector, we think you're maybe in the middle innings of that. We published a report a while back where we said, technology, if the sector was to get it right, could add 200 basis points to margin. So if margins are 28% today, they could go to 30 because of technology. The way we think about it is the company have done a good job around back office in terms of consolidating call centers and using technology around ERP and enterprise resource planning systems, et cetera. Where I think, you're still in earlier innings is, maybe using autonomous machinery at the landfill. Autonomous trucks are a long way away. We got to get autonomous cars right first. But, could there be a time where you see an autonomous truck picking up trash at midnight when there's no traffic, maybe in certain areas? So I do think from a machinery standpoint, you're in early innings there. We do think a lot of the online purchasing of waste is in early innings. We do think that some of the service capability around online is also relatively early innings. And so, yeah, I'd say from a technology perspective, we're probably mid-innings, and some companies are a little ahead than others. But generally, we'd say that there's still room for improvement.
Great. And then I remember when we reviewed your 40 Under 40 nomination, Will Flower had raved about how you have such vision and you understand the big picture so well, beyond just the financial side of businesses. What do you think about the industry as a whole, and really what attracted you to it, considering you probably had a lot of sexy options coming out of Stanford?
Well, thank you so much. Will's a very kind man. But what I would say is that, I think what attracted me to this industry and what still does is that it's a very close-knit industry. And I think once you're in, you're in. And there's a lot of people within the industry that are around to mentor you. And so I grew up in the industry and, had good mentors like, Jim O'Connor in the industry, who was the CEO of Republic for a while, very close with our current management teams as well, Jim Fish, Don Slager, Ron Middlestad, Worthing Jackman. And so, I view this sector very much as a close-knit family. I also think that the businesses tend to be not very cyclical. They generate a lot of free cash flow through the cycle. There's a lot of M&A potential. And also I think that over time, this sector has a pricing story as well. And so you really have fundamentally everything that you'd like in a good business, and you have a very close-knit sort of family-type environment with great mentorship in the space. So very lucky to be part of it and look forward to many more years in it.
Oh, that's great. And so true. It's such a great community. And then speaking of, what advice would you have for people entering this industry?
I think the advice I would have is, get in early is I think the best advice that I could give. I do think there's a lot of options within the industry to get in, whether that's finance, whether that's operations, and I think, you can even get in at the driver level and work yourself up. There's CEOs who've done that, who've been very successful taking that route as well. There's a lot of companies there's a lot of guys that maybe if you can't get a job at one of the big guys, Waste Republic, Waste Connections, etc. There's some new companies up and coming like GFL. At the same time, there's a lot of private companies. You see a lot of companies that are private and then sell themselves to like a waste management, 2-3 truck operations even. So I would say, you get in early, whatever route you can use to get in. And if you can't get to one of the big guys, maybe you join a private company and take that route. But I'd say, getting in early is best.
That's great advice. And speaking of GFL, wow, that's a success story, huh? That starting out small and becoming maybe the fourth largest in the industry.
Right. Yeah, it's we think Patrick has done a great job there. They've grown the business very successfully. They've now done some large transactions in the U.S. marketplace. They already had a pretty strong Canadian business, and I think the IPO has given them more liquidity and put them on the radar with public investors. Where I think you could see that business, continue to grow pretty fast, and we'll continue to keep watching that.
That's great. It's still, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening even with this blip, this unusual, unprecedented blip on the radar, huh?
That's right. Yeah, I think waste is a defensive place to be right now, and if it continues to trade down with the market, I think one can get a pretty good entry point long term in the name. I know there were a lot of investors sort of sitting on the sidelines saying, the waste stocks are pretty expensive, when we were looking earlier this year before the virus hit. So, maybe we can get a good entry point in some of these names for investors.
And then anything else you think we should be paying attention to, or our listeners in the world of waste, recycling, and organics?
I think the only thing we're paying attention to is, is there anything that comes out of the election? If Trump continues, I think it's status quo. But, if the Democrats come in, is there anything that they do to corporate tax reform? Because this sector benefited a lot from U.S. tax rate going down for corporations from, 30-odd% to 20-odd%. If that changes, that's a very big negative for this space. So, because this space was the biggest beneficiary of U.S. tax reform in the S&P 500. And so we look at that and are paying attention to that. That's one thing to watch out for. We don't think this will happen in the U.S., frankly, but, in Europe, they obviously have something called the EU landfill directive that essentially charges taxes on landfills, which has led to a very big uptick in recycling. Recycling is maybe half of, waste disposal in Europe. We don't think that ever happens in the U.S. There's a lot of landfill capacity, but to the extent that, you see somebody change regulation, we're paying attention to that, although chances are very, very slim there. Those are some of the things outside of technology in the space that we're paying attention to today.
Okay, that sounds great. So what's next for you with your career and where you are at Jefferies and what lies ahead for you?
Yeah, so we have a big team at Jefferies. I run business services research there, which includes about 33 companies. So we cover other stuff besides the waste space, although we like the waste space a lot, as we talked about. So, I think being a valuable asset to my clients and continue to try to help them in the investor education process or help them find new opportunities and just be a resource in the space. So continue to add value to my clients long term. And then I think on the corporate side, help my corporates meet the right investors who will help them with fundraising, capital raising, as well as be long-term partners in the business to help grow their business. So in general, bottom line, just, continue to try to add value in the space and to all my clients is, my goal longer term.
Good for you. That's great. Well, you're already doing that, and we can't wait to watch what else lies ahead for you. And I hope you can come to the 40 Under 40 little reunion we're having at Waste Expo. We would love to have you, and you can meet all of the new award winners who have bright futures like you.
Great. I wish I was under 40 forever, but I appreciate it. I look forward to it.
Oh, we do too. And thanks for taking the time, because I know this is such a crazy time for you guys and watching how everything unfolds with the market, but we really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Talk soon. Thank you.
Talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.